and I'm delighted and excited to be able to welcome Padraig Tuama. He's known to many of you, and he's a poet, a theologian, the former leader of the Corrymeela community, and an all-round very, I was going to say all-round good man. But he teaches, he speaks, and all throughout the world. And I'm just delighted that we were able to get him. And it was one of the gifts of the pandemic. Yes, there were gifts, and there will be more gifts, but they may not be apparent just yet. But one of the gifts of the COVID was that wherever he was in the world, he was able to be part of this year's Fuse because of having to do it virtually online. So it gives me great pleasure to hand over to the wonderful Padraig Tuama.
Thanks very much, Stephen, and hello to everybody. It's lovely to be with you. Do you have other things to say, Stephen, or will I just launch right in? No, we're all good. I'm delighted.
No, I was just waving.
Okay.
Hello, and I was just waving.
Well, I am delighted to be with you. Thanks very much for the opportunity to be with you all today at your Fuse gathering for 2021. I know I have a soft voice, so you might want to make sure to turn up the volume on your computer if you're struggling to hear me. We're going to be thinking a little bit about resilience today and what it means to hold the center. And by that, I don't mean the political center. I don't mean anything like neutrality. I mean hold the core of what the heart is, and hold ourselves together in that place. And I think that we need a few ironic things when we do that. One is to find something that enlivens the heart, and two is to be a very secular person. And I think keeping in contact with the heart and with the call to secularism are two things that can help us hold the center. By secularism, I don't mean anything about religion, for or against. Secularism comes from the same word as siècle comes from in French, the word for century. And secularism really is an invitation to be present to your world, to be present in the here and now, to know what's going on in some of the worlds in which you inhabit, to read the news, to listen to the news, to be aware of politics, to be aware of the dynamics, to be aware of the public climate of fear, and to be aware of the things that are calling communities of people to courage in the space of a current political climate. And for that, I think we need the place of the heart. And in order that the place of the heart doesn't live in its own luxury, we need to know what world we're living in, what political climate we're living in, and that even if things are easy enough for you, they are not easy enough for everybody else. And this, I think, is what it means to hold the center, to be present in this place, to be aware of the world, not thinking that my ease is everybody's ease, or my troubles are everybody's troubles, but to find a way in the middle of all that to hold a center that says, here's what I can offer, here's what's nurtured in the heart for me to offer into the complicated parts of the worlds around me. And the worlds around you might be your neighbor who you chat to over the fence, or that person that you've spoken to on the phone once a week and that's continued on during lockdown and COVID, or it might be your family members, or it might be former colleagues, it might be your work, it might be current colleagues, it might be your clients. It can be all kinds of ways. I'm not talking about the whole wide world, I'm talking about the worlds you live in. And so that's what I'm going to talk about today, really, is to try to think about what can hold us in the center while we are present to the world. I will use lots of poetry. Some of the poems will probably be disheartening. That's deliberate, because to look at the world is an invitation at times to go, here's where the muscle of the heart needs to be flexed. And then other poems will be heartening, because we need the heart to be nurtured as we're flexing the heart. And so that's deliberate. I'll be going back and forth between stories that will lift you up and stories that will sober us as well when it comes to what does it mean to be present in the world. So yeah, I'll start off with a poem. Here's a poem called In the Name. In the name of goodness, of love, and of broken community, in the name of meaning, of feeling, and I hope you don't screw me. In the name of darkness and light and ungraspable twilight, in the name of mealtimes and sharing and caring by firelight, in the name of action, of peace and human redemption, in the name of eating and drinking and table confession, in the name of sadness, regret, and holy obsession, in the holy name of anger, the spirit of aggression, we gather here, a room full of strangers, and speak of our hopeland and talk of our danger. We make sense of our thinking and authenticate lives and humanize feeling and stop telling lies. In the name of philosophy, of theology, and who gives a damn, in the name of employment and study and finding new family, in the name of our passions, our lovings and indecent obsessions, in the name of prayer and of worship and of demon possession, in the name of solitude, of quiet and holy reflection, in the name of the lost and the lonely and the without direction, in the name of the early and the late, and the holy ineffectual, the straight, the queer, transgender, and bisexual, in the name of boot clogs and boob jobs and erectile dysfunction, schizophrenia, hysteria, and obsessive compulsion, in the name of Jesus and Mary and the mostly silent Joseph, in the name of speaking to ourselves, saying, "This is more than I can cope with," in the name of touch-up, and breakup and breakdown and weeping, in the name of therapy and Prozac and full-hearted breathing, in the name of sadness and madness and years since I've smiled, in the name of the unknown, the alien, and the holy in exile, in the name of the named and the unnamed and the names of the nameless, in the name of the prayers that repeat, I wish that I could change this. In the name of goodness and kindness and intentionality. In the name of harbor and shelter and family. My own work over the last 25 years has really centered around three things: poetry, theology, and conflict. And for me, those three things are an invitation into the consideration of language. How can language be adequate for us to be present to our world? How can we tell the truth to each other? Tell a truth that can be brutal at times, and tell a truth also that lifts us towards who and how we can be together as a human community. And I think that is something that has been necessary for all of us, to find ways where words are comforting enough and challenging enough at the same time. I've got a poem here called Shaking Hands, which is a piece of irony, really, in the era of COVID. A number of years back, toward the end of the Queen's Jubilee, she came on a visit to Belfast, and during that time she shook the hand of Martin McGuinness, who at that stage was the Deputy First Minister of the Stormont Assembly. Each considered the other the enemy. He considered her to be the face of British imperialism that has had such a devastating effect on Ireland. She considered him to be the face of Irish terrorist response to British imperialism that has had a devastating effect on British populations, including the murder of her favourite cousin, Lord Mountbatten. So each had been personally bereaved through the political actions that each represented, and they each lost support from their own sides for what they did, which is a strange and curious thing. And they were going to be shaking hands. And that's all it was, two people shaking hands. But it was also enormous, because for some people they were saying, what, are you justifying what happened there? Other people are saying, are you erasing my own grief? And this was coming from both the Irish and the British side. So each side considers itself the victim within the context of this. And I think that's really important, to displace whatever central victim narrative we use, is to recognize that in situations of conflict, there's conflict about conflict. We don't agree on what the problem is. Some people will say, oh, the Irish Troubles began in 1968. most people in Ireland would go, "Are you joking? 1604, my God." And we can have this conversation because we're speaking in a colonized language rather than in our own indigenous language. And so there's ways within which we each have to find ways to learn how to speak the language of each other. And often that will need some level of gesture. And the level of gesture that was needed at this moment was that we could see in a small, humble way that Martin McGuinness and Queen Elizabeth could shake hands. And that was enormous. So I was invited to be a poet at the event. And so I wrote a poem called Shaking Hands. I suppose why I want to share this with you is because I think that shaking hands during the time when we can do it, and we look forward again to the small moments when the simplicity of shaking hands will be possible without worrying about infection. It is a small gesture, but it's a small gesture in the face of something enormous. I think the only background you need to this is that Tuama is the name of a town where in 1998 there was a terrible bomb. A few months after the Good Friday Peace Agreement, the real IRA planted a bomb that killed 32 people. So in 1998, lots of you will remember that, or lots of you will remember exactly where you were. I don't think there's anybody in the north that doesn't know exactly where you were the day that we heard about that horrific bomb, as well as all the other ones, Enniskillen, Bloody Sunday, Shankill bomb, all these other terrible atrocities that happened. So shaking hands. There's a little phrase in Irish at the beginning of this, and that's simply the date that it happened, which was the 27th of June 2012. Shaking hands. Because what's the alternative? Because of courage, because of loved ones lost, because it's a small thing, shaking hands. It happens every day. Because I heard of one man whose hands haven't been shaken since a market day in Tuama. Because it takes a second to say hate, but it takes longer, much longer, to be a great leader. Much, much longer. Because shared space without human touching doesn't amount to much. Because it's easier to speak to your own than to hold the hand of someone whose side has previously been described, proscribed, denied. Because it is tough. Because it is meant to be tough. Because it has taken so long. Because it has taken land and money and languages and barrels of blood. Because lives have been lost. Because lives have been taken. Because to be bereaved is to be troubled by grief. Because more than two troubled peoples live here. Because I know a woman whose hand hasn't been shaken since she was mistaken for a man. Because shaking a hand is only a part of the start. Because I know a woman whose touch calmed a man whose heart was breaking. Because privilege is not to be taken lightly. Because this just might be good. Because who said that this would be easy? Because some people love what you stand for. And for some, if you can, they can. Because solidarity means a common hand. Because a hand is only a hand. So hang on to it. So join your much discussed hands. We need this for one small second. So touch. So lead. In many ways, that poem is trying to use some of the furniture of devastation that we've known here in the British-Irish Troubles, as well as then to hold that together with a small, naive moment of something being born. And I use the word naive deliberately because naive comes from the word for to be born. And everything's fragile when it's born. Nobody, when they're born, is expected to be able to perform at the level of their civic responsibilities. But sometimes we decry something that starts simply because it's only been born, and we hold it to a standard and cut it off before it's been given time to mature. And this, I think, is what that attempt of shaking hands was. It was an attempt that was happening kind of at the beginning of what in Ireland we're calling the decade of centenaries. There was the Ulster Covenant when hundreds of people, Protestant people, had signed a document in blood saying that they would never consider an Irish independence. And then there was the uprising in 1916 in Dublin, after which the leaders of the uprising calling for Irish independence were summarily executed. Now, in 2021, we are marking the centenary of the partition of Ireland. And back in 2012, what I think the Crown, the British government, the Irish government, and the Irish presidency knew was that in the midst of facing into 100 years, a centenary that was going to be marked over the next decade, what we needed was small moments of public warmth between Ireland and Britain. And that began with the most extraordinary visit of the Queen to Ireland, overwhelming, deeply moving, during which she started off a civic address speaking in Irish, which is just protocol, of course. If she was going to France, she'd start off speaking in French. If she was going to Japan, she'd have a couple of words of Japanese. On the one hand, that's just basic, 101 diplomacy. But for a member of the Royal Crown to speak in Irish, a language that the Royal Crown had been involved in creating policy that decimated, that for us was overwhelming and was a deeply moving gesture. To say that was thought through, and her pronunciation was perfect, overwhelming. When she spoke in Irish, she just said 5 words, which means president and friends. That's the formal address. When you're speaking to a large group of people in Irish, you don't say ladies and gentlemen, you say a harja, which means friends. That is the formal way to address a large group of people in Irish. And she started off by saying that, and the president at the time, Mary McAleese, was in the room, and you saw her just go, wow, because she caught the national moment. Most people expected that the Queen would say something in Irish, because that's just taken for granted that you would, but there was something about hearing it from the Queen speaking in Irish. And that was the first of civic gestures toward Britishness and Irishness that was being imagined in the last 10 years. And then there was a reciprocal visit of the Irish president. There was a new one at that stage, Michael D. Higgins, who had been voted in, and he made a reciprocal visit back to Britain, which was the first time of a formal state visit of an Irish president to Britain. The president in Ireland is not like the American president. The president in Ireland is a constitutional leadership, and they're mostly a cultural figure who do have the power to dissolve government, but it isn't like the American president. So we have a Taoiseach, I suppose you might consider that like a prime minister, who is the elected, voted head of parliament, as well as a president. And there was the reciprocal visit back and forth. And the whole hope, I think, was that in the midst of a difficult centenary of Britishness and Irishness, that we could do this thing that you're interested in too, which is to hold the center. Different political viewpoints, different ways of remembering the past, but to find a way to hold the center. And I'm sure people inside here voted very differently regarding Brexit, and there are good people who voted in different ways for Brexit. So I'm not anybody to tell people in Britain how they should vote. However, the impact of Brexit in Ireland has been that all of the gestures that we knew we needed, all of the ways of tenderly birthing gestures that could hold the center in this most difficult of decade of centenaries for us. A decade of centenaries that often our lamentation here is that lots of people on the island of Britain simply don't know the fact that Britain has been intimately involved in everything that's happened in Ireland for the last 500 years. And that when we remember our pain, we are remembering British-Irish pain, not just Irish pain. Brexit has really gotten in the way of that. That wasn't the intention. That's not what people voted for. People voted for all kinds of reasons. But there has been an unintended impact. And how do we hold the center? What do we do? I live right on the border. The border is 2 fields there. It's a field, it's a fence. The hares that come into my garden come from across the way in County Donegal, okay? This is what the border is. The border is a blade of grass that is not partitioned. The border is a blade of grass in Ireland. And this is something that on a daily basis, I now face that border and think that somehow, for all kinds of reasons that I don't think needed to happen, we are being faced with an experience in Ireland where we are trying desperately to hold the center. This is what I mean by being a secular person who has the language of the heart, facing into the realities of the politics of the day and trying to think, how can we hold ourselves together? And the awful thing about this is that just because I can hold myself together with writing some poems or reading some poems, that doesn't mean a damn thing when it comes to trying to survive in an Ireland we hope can be more peaceful in its relationships with Britain, when sometimes it seems to me that the Westminster government, not the people of England, Scotland or Wales, but the Westminster government has not been really interested in that over the last while. That pamphlet we got about Brexit didn't mention Ireland at all. And so therefore we were thinking, what on earth is supposed to happen here? I now have to carry a thing with me when I drive across the border, which, as you know, is a couple of fields away, in order that if I'm stopped on either side, I can validate that I can drive legally on my own island. An extraordinary interruption into the story about what British-Irish peace needs to be here. Again, that's not what people voted for. But from the moment that it was initiated, we in Ireland knew this is what's going to happen. We knew it beforehand, we knew it on the day, and we know it now. This is no surprise to us that this was going to be the level of interruption. And how do we hold the center? How do we pay attention? I'm not going to talk too much more about politics because you don't need to know too much more about that. But it is important for me to say that in a day of reflection on spirituality and on a day of reflection about holding the center, that unless we're paying attention to the politics that affect some people, even if not all, well, then we're not paying attention. That there needs to be ways where we pay attention to the seriousness of the impact of the secular society in which we live. And by secular, again, I don't mean anti-religious. I mean a society that somehow is present to the world. And a spirituality that is reading the newspaper, that is taking politics and history seriously, especially the most inconvenient parts of history. And that's important to say. I deliberately read the stories about Irish people who were in Jamaica, Irish people who fled Ireland during the famine, a famine that didn't need to happen. But Irish people often consider ourselves, because we suffered, we lost land and languages and our own sovereignty. Because of that, Irish people assume, well, therefore, we would have been the friends of the indigenous people all across the world, the friends of enslaved people, the friends of dispossessed people. Not true. In the mid-1800s, when Irish people were fleeing, starving, dispossessed of land and language around the world, lots of times Irish people discovered, check it out, we're white, and suddenly joined in the project of empire. And so what's important for me is to deliberately seek out stories that displace the convenient telling of the Irish past of history, and that challenge and lose me friends in terms of the public statement about how Irish history has been. And I think that is a secular and moral obligation on all of us who come from places that have had world expanding histories through the stories of our diaspora, whether that's a diaspora due to dispossession and famine, or whether that's a diaspora due to empire, to deliberately seek out the tellings of history that make us uncomfortable. I know how to do that for Ireland. I'm not the one to say how British people should do it, but I think it certainly should be done. I'd like to spend a bit of time thinking a little bit about some religious text. I know that people in here come from entirely different points of view on religious text. I do too. I probably have 5 or 6 different approaches to religious text. My deep interest in religious text is, and the Gospels in this situation, is that they're literature. And so we're going to look at this as literature. I probably have 5 or 6 different thoughts as to what I think of this character of Jesus of Nazareth, and I hold them all together. And that's the enjoyment of having this character in literature to explore. And so we're going to look at a text about him and then consider that. It's a text that does involve a miracle, which we will talk a little bit about. I've got the text put up on the screen. Just double check, where is the text? There we are. I'm going to share again. I lost it there for a sec. Here. So this is the chapter of John, chapter 6. John is the fourth of four Gospels, and it was written maybe around the year 90, possibly as late as the year 110. It's the latest one. It has the most elevated kind of theologies about Jesus and an assertion of his divine character. After this, Jesus went to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, also called the Sea of Tiberias. A large crowd kept following him because they saw the signs that he was doing for the sick. Jesus went up the mountain and sat down there with his disciples. Now the Passover, the festival of the Jews, was near. When he looked up and saw a large crowd coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread for these people to eat?" He said this to test him, for he himself knew what he was going to do. Philip answered him, 6 months' wages would not buy enough bread for each of them to get a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There's a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But what are they among so many people?" Jesus said, "Make the people sit down." Now, there was a great deal of grass in the place, so they sat down, about 5,000 in all. Then Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated, so also the fish, as much as they wanted. When they were satisfied, he told his disciples, "Gather up the fragments left over, so that nothing may be lost." So they gathered them up, and from the fragments of the 5 barley loaves left by those who had eaten, they filled 12 baskets. When the people saw the sign that he had done, they began to say, "This is indeed the prophet who is to come into the world." When Jesus realized that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, he withdrew again to the mountain by himself. So that's the first part of the text that we're going to look at. We are going to look at the next part of the text. But first of all, a little story. A family that I know, when their son was 10, their class was looking at this text in school. And the teacher came from a very devoted Christian point of view. And so the 10-year-old has grown up in a family that are part of Corrymeela, that take the text with great reverence, but also take it with a serious amount of criticism and a critiqued engagement. And so the 10-year-old said, the way that I understand this story is that when the boy offered what he had, that everybody else thought, well, I've got a bit, and I've got a bit, and I've got a bit. And suddenly they realized, we've got enough. And the teacher sent my friend's son, who was 10 years old, to the headmaster for having spoken out of turn in class. My friend's son, who was 10, is a very polite, very gentle, and deliciously self-assured young fella. And so he said to the headmaster, "This is strange. We were reading a story about a small boy who made an offering. I'm a small boy, and now I'm in trouble." And I thought his analysis was quite extraordinary. He was not only able to read the text with intelligence, he was able to read his circumstances with intelligence. And he saw through the text into the story of what happens when somebody offers something that's small, that you don't think is enough, and that you don't even like. And I thought he has expanded that text into great meaning. His mother was called in to meet the headmaster, and his mother was like, "We're entirely proud of him, A, for what he said to his class, and B, for what he said to you. Under no circumstances would we consider this to be any kind of a problem." And I thought he was theologically precise in terms of the critique he offered and what he offered in. And that, I think, is so important for us to pay attention to. I know lots of people who, when they read this text, want to read it as a miracle. And I think that's a beautiful thing to pay attention to. What bothers me is when we punish or deride those who don't read it in the same way that we do. I'm not interested in lying either and saying, "Oh, it doesn't matter, it's all fine." But humiliating people within the context about how they read a text is never going to help us come to some kind of level of holding attention well, holding a center. And again, I don't mean a center by some ridiculous middle ground fence that doesn't exist and that doesn't pay attention to its own privilege. By holding the center, I mean a way to hold the way we talk to each other with a level of engagement and heart, and to do that together. That is what's really important to me. For years and years and years, I've been involved as a conflict mediator, often working with clergy who were quite opposed to the lives of LGBT people being public and visible in the world, as well as then LGBT people. I'm a gay man myself. One of the things that has become clear to me over the years is that I hold to an invitation, which is to love the gospel and to take no shit. And it has been really important for me to hold the two of those together, because it is too easy to imagine. If I just play nice and just imagine that there's a middle ground where we can say, let's agree to disagree and that'll all be lovely, that isn't holding the center. That is actually participating in danger, because people like me, people like you, have suffered as a result of privileged imaginations that it's possible to live on a fence and go, it's all fine, let's just live and let live. We can't do that. That fence doesn't exist if your life is in danger. I know you know that. The fence of the question of women's equity and women's equality is not supported by men saying, let's just agree to disagree on the question of the dignity of women. Let's just agree to disagree. That will not support the safety of 51% of the population in terms of the powers that are needing to be examined. And so I do not believe that holding the center is about holding middle ground. I believe that holding the center is about finding a way to say, let's have a damned good argument about this. Let's disagree deeply and do it without threat, recourse to violence or threat. To do it in a way where we elevate the conversation and we say, this is what's possible when we stay in a room. And I think this is one of the interesting things that Jesus of Nazareth is doing in this text. Jesus of Nazareth is offering people an opportunity to pay attention to their own generosity. Okay, he's offering them in this text we just looked to say, this young fella has brought bread and fish, barley loaves, and barley loaves were the first loaves to be made after the harvest. And they were the ones that were offered in the place of the temple, but they were also cheap. So it indicates possibly that this boy, whoever made the barley loaves, his mother, I was guessing, that he did not come from a family with a lot of money, but nonetheless, he offered what he had. And therefore, others, perhaps by seeing that gesture, began to offer what they had and realized there is a way of turning towards each other where we can support and supply for each other, which is quite an extraordinary anarchism in a certain sense in terms of the population that was there. The population that was there was clearly desperate for a leader. Give us a leader, give us a leader. We want a new king, we want a new king, give us that. And Jesus goes, turn to each other. What can you give each other? An extraordinary democratization of the experience about what the anxiety that was there in the room. A people under oppression, a people under a foreign power, the Romans. And the Romans were awful. My God, the things the Romans did were terrible. Crucifying 30 people all at once as a public gesture of humiliation of circumcised men in public. Awful. These are the things that Pilate was over. Pilate was not a kind of a morally ambiguous character. Pilate was bloodthirsty when it came to questions. And then he also lacked courage. He was both bloodthirsty and under pressure. He was weak. That's a really important thing for us to understand about Pilate. And then here's what happens. People have an experience of turning to each other going, look at how and who we can be. And they go, I know, let's make you king. No wonder Jesus fled. He was saying your crisis is a crisis of imagination about what a population can be. Look at how you can support each other when you turn to each other and offer to each other what's possible. Look at that. And immediately they go, let's just make you the new king. Magnificent. We've had a picnic. Let's call you the prime minister of picnics. Fantastic. Go. Jesus had a deep critique about the question of a people's understanding about what leadership looks like, and also about what's possible for leadership to do. And leadership, I think it's really important to say, is not meant to be adequate for everything. Let's look back to the Good Friday Agreement. The Good Friday Agreement, and I would encourage everybody to read it as a demonstration about quite how beautiful and moving the British-Irish language can be when we speak about each other. The Good Friday Agreement is a formal renouncing of sovereignty of Northern Ireland by the British Crown. That's one of the shocking things. It's also a formal renouncing of the claim to territorial constitutional ownership of the north of Ireland by the Irish Constitution. The Good Friday Agreement says, the future of the people of Ireland will be decided by the people of Ireland. This has caused too much bloodshed to be decided by a government. So at some point in the future, the people of Ireland have full sovereignty to decide for themselves how the jurisdictional question is solved. It's not a threat to breaking up the United Kingdom. In a certain sense, the Good Friday Agreement already did that by saying, actually, this will be treated very differently than other parts of what's called the United Kingdom. This is to be decided by the people who have lived through such terror in the name of history. And it is saying that no matter what the outcome of that is, that Britishness and Irishness will be guaranteed as a passport identity for all the peoples of the north of Ireland in perpetuity. So even in a united Ireland, the British government will continue to give British passports to the people of Northern Ireland, because in a current United Kingdom that includes Northern Ireland, the Irish government still offer Irish passports to people born in the north of Ireland. And that's what we're saying. And what I think is brilliant is that it's saying, here's what politics is capable of doing, but actually here's where the people need to learn to turn to each other and figure this shit out and find a way to do it. And by the people, I don't just mean the people of the north of Ireland. I mean the people of all of Ireland. And ultimately, I also mean the people of Britain. And this, I think, is what is facing us. And I think there is a critical conversation with this extraordinary text that we're reading from the Gospel of John, because the people were turning to each other saying, look at what's capable on a macro community level when we turn to each other. And then you see that old demon of addiction to the idolatry of one person solving everything for us. Come, let's make you king. No wonder Jesus fled. And one of the things I think we're needing to pay attention to is, what does community politics look like? What does it mean for communities to hold our centre together? What would it mean to have a civic forum? What would it mean, rather than saying we will expect the Prime Minister over the next 5 years to solve everything, or we'll crucify them, or we will expect this, or we will expect that? What does it mean to turn to local politics to think, actually, this is our jurisdiction. We are going to take responsibility and demand responsibility for this question here. And how do we hold that centre well? Because one of the things that I think is really frightening about the human condition is that we are mostly frightened of our own possibility. I've seen over and over again that the thing that undermines people is not their fear. Everybody's got fear. But one of the places where I've seen most often where individuals choose to explode the possibility that's among them is because they've realized, look at what's possible. And then we turn to the old addiction. We choose a bad king. We blow something up. One time, working with a bunch of young people, I had asked everybody to take some clay and make the shape of anger. And this young guy, he was about 14, and he was no artist, but he had made this extraordinary thing. It was a bomb. And then he had flattened the clay between his fingers so that it was like the thinnest pastry. And he had these explosions coming out of the bomb. It was a work of great beauty. It really was. And this was just on a Friday evening youth group in West Belfast. You know, this wasn't in an art conservatorium. I can't even say the word. And like, everybody was watching it going, what is that? Because the invitation was to make the shape of your anger. And he said, this is a bomb of my own anger. And he was so vulnerable and so precise and had a quiet confidence. And the boy next to him slammed his fist down on it, slammed the whole piece of art. And everybody was shocked into silence. This brilliant piece of art was suddenly flattened. And I said to the boy who'd done that, "Why did you do that?" And he went, "It was funny." Of course, everybody knew it wasn't funny. Sometimes I think we can't cope with the possibility about what self-steadied vulnerability looks like in public. We'd rather explode it. We'd rather shut it down. This young fella, this 14-year-old in a room of boys in West Belfast has shown this is what leadership, speaking for yourself, speaking about vulnerability and speaking about power looks like, quite brilliantly and also quite beautifully. And the message given was, no, shut that down. And this, I think, again, is the message that we see in the story that we just looked at, in the story of the feeding of the 5,000. I really don't care as to the question of the miracle or not. What I think is really interesting is that the people found a solution that was working for the people, and then the people turned to an old addiction, but an addictive relationship with the question of leadership. And Jesus, whatever you think about him, I think he was psychologically interesting and psychologically perceptive. He escaped, he left, he went up to the top of the mountain. Let's turn back to the text. So you see here, when the people saw the sign that he had done, they began to say, "This is indeed the prophet who is to come into the world." And then when Jesus realized that they were about to come and take him, look at that word, by force to make him king, he withdrew again to the mountain by himself. Here's the extraordinary thing. Like, there wasn't the capacity to make him king. Like, there wasn't the constitutional independence for such a thing to happen, which was very, very interesting. But nonetheless, there was this deep desire to turn to an old hope. Here's the next part, which I find to be so insightful on a literary level. When evening came, so this is directly related, but somehow there is a period of time where Jesus has been away. When evening came, his disciples went down to the sea, got into a boat, and started across the sea to Capernaum. It was now dark, and Jesus had not yet come to them. The sea became rough because a strong wind was blowing. When they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea and coming near the boat, and they were terrified. But he said to them, "It is I, do not be afraid." Then they wanted to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat reached the land toward which they were going. It's a very short little excerpt. How many words is it? 106 words, but there is so much in it, which I think is so beautiful. This is the evening, and they've gone down. Remember that Jesus has gone to the mountain, which would imply going up. And I think the original Greek might imply the word up explicitly. So the disciples go down to the sea, and they get into a boat, and they go across the sea, and it's dark and there's a strong wind blowing. So therefore it can be difficult to see. What's strange is that they do see. They see Jesus walking on the sea. And even though they see Jesus, he says to them, "It is I." He has to reintroduce himself to them. And the invitation is, do not be afraid. And this, I think, is one of the invitations that we have to face into, is the consideration of not being afraid. Because ultimately a certain idolatry of leadership is setting a leader up so that we can crucify them. Even great praise of a leader is usually that, so that you can pull them down from their pedestal afterwards. Wilfred Bion, for any of you who are interested in psychoanalysis, Wilfred Bion wrote a book called Experiences in Groups, and he talks about one of the 3 manifestations of group hostility is praise. And any of us who have been in situations of leadership have known that when people say, "Oh, you have been the leader in our parish, in our organization, in our society, in our community, in our borough, you are the one that we have been waiting for," you know that when you hear that, you go, "Oh, bloody hell, when is all of this going to fall apart?" You know that very well. That praise itself is its own dagger, just waiting, because it's saying, one time a man said to me in the context of my leadership, "What's amazing is that you haven't yet disappointed me." And I was like, oh, God almighty. I was deeply depressed. I would have much rather had he said to me, "You really disappointed me this morning." Then I could have gone, "Fantastic, let's talk about it." But the "you haven't yet," my God, what he was confirming was that he was wishing to enter into my super ego as a little voice that would condemn me over and over and over again. Have I disappointed Martin yet? Have I disappointed Martin yet? Have I disappointed Martin yet? I asked it every day for 5 years, and the answer was on a regular basis. Of course, that was the whole point of that strange and manipulative piece of communication. And so the adulation sometimes itself is a mark of great hostility. And what Jesus is doing is saying, you won't recognize me. Don't think you own me. It's a fascinating model of leadership that Jesus has. It is distanced in a certain sense. And I suppose what I want to ask when it comes to the imagination of what does it mean to hold the center, what held his center? I mean, maybe some people want to say because he was the Son of God. Okay, I don't actually know what that means. I've written essays about it, but I still don't know what that means. What held his center? Maybe a morning meditation. Certainly he does seem to be a person who likes getting up and sometimes spending all night by himself. Maybe he needed his space. I think he also, alongside meditation and prayer, he had an extraordinary imagination. And he also had an extraordinary intelligence. And by that, I don't mean he did very well in his A levels. He might have, he mightn't have, I have no idea. But what's clear is his intelligence was present. And he had the capacity in moments of pressure to give himself space to think, what do I think about that? Later on in the Gospel of John, just before Jesus is about to be summarily executed by a colonizing power, he speaks to Pilate and he says to Pilate, why are you talking to me like this? And a guard slaps him. And then Jesus, knowing, of course, that he's about to be tortured and murdered, Jesus turns to the guard and said, did I speak wrong? Because if I did, tell me. But if I didn't, tell me why you hit me. How do you hold that center? That is loving integrity and taking no shit. There is a capacity that Jesus of Nazareth has to somehow hold the center in a way that makes me think he was the most deeply secular man that I've ever read about during that era, phenomenally present to the politics of his time, and somehow not giving the politics of his time the capacity to displace his own center. He held his own center. Mostly, there are a few moments where you see him spill over, which are very heartening to go, oh, thank God. But we're not going to look at those this morning. What holds his center? Maybe it's a guesswork. Maybe it was his meditation. Maybe it was his intelligence. Maybe it was his imagination. Maybe it was the fact that he knew his own text very well and had in himself the imaginative space to reinterpret texts in new ways. And I think that is a really powerful thing, that he knew them, but wasn't confined by them. And I think we need to have those capacities when it comes to our civic texts, whether that's a religious one or a constitution or an act of parliament or a history book, to know them and also to not be under them as if they're the only and final word, to find a way to expand the imagination, to go, where's the space for me here? A little bit like that young fella that I know who said to his headmaster, what's strange is that this is a story about a small boy offering something, and I'm a small boy who's offered something, and now I'm in trouble. An amazing sense of giving space to the self. I'm going to read a few poems. I think, am I right? Let me see if I can see Stephen. Am I right that I'm going for about another 20 minutes and then we're going to break? Is that right?
Yeah, that would be great. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks, Stephen. So let me share the screen. I'm going to put the text of the poems up because I know that can be easier. Sitting in our own living rooms or kitchens or in a corner of a house somewhere and listening along to poetry, I know isn't always the easiest. So I'm going to put the texts up just to make it a little bit easier. Text of the poems. Here's one that is written about Jesus. Here is the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. This is a sort of sonnet. It's at least a 14-line poem. You weren't that perfect, weren't lamb pure or cocksure with certainty. You weren't as innocent as you're made out to be. You knew people. You knew power games, knew that the main aim of ambition is ambition. You knew the names of other people's fears because you had plenty of your own. You knew the touch of a friend was not dependent on their cleanliness. And you knew this because you knew need, knew the way that story bleeds through actions of a day, and how shame makes us play parts that are beneath us. You are beneath us and above us in the song we sang as children. You are in the piss and blood. You are spit mixed with mud. You are the rotting hand of God waiting for a hand to hold. You're not gold. You're rock cracked open. This poem came about as a result of a Jewish friend of mine saying to me that while Jesus is a Jew, he was saying that he finds the Christian texts phenomenally un-Jewish at times because they're so determined to speak about Jesus as perfect. And he says that makes me realize that, makes me feel that the texts that Christianity uses to speak about Jesus are extraordinarily un-Jewish in the way that they are addicted to telling a certain story of perfection, because every character of great renown in Judaism has fundamental flaws that are spoken of with great courage. It's one of the reasons why I find Judaism and Judaism's texts so moving and extraordinary and courageous as a civic and literary project. I mentioned earlier on that I'm gay, and when I was younger, I was put through a whole variety of exorcisms. And here's a poem about one of them. Exorcisms to get rid of the gay devils in me, which were, I'm delighted to say, magnificently unsuccessful. All the gay devils are in me still. Strangely, the exorcisms were the things that did birth demons in me, birth demons of rage and fury. And in a strange way, attention to a devil that wasn't there brought about devilish moments in my life of profound anger. The Exorcist was from the United States, which is why there's a reference to American in this. The Exorcism. I wish you weren't American. I wish you didn't see intrinsic evil in me. I wish you hadn't dragged my secret from me. Now I know you knew already, someone squealed. I wish you didn't put your hands on me while you were screaming at the devils in me, all my homosexualities. I wish you'd never gathered people around, instructing them to pray in tongues or read from Revelations or chant, Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. I wish you'd shut up. And I repeated, Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. I wish you'd answered. I wished you'd dead. And I was frightened at the violence in me and the nest of demons in me. I wondered where they lived, in my semen, in the dreams I had of being kissed. Why did they breed in me? My God, my exorcist. So one of the things I was in need of doing was learning how to step back from Christianities, especially charismatic Christianities, and have space enough to think my own thoughts. And strangely, it was by a close reading of the Gospels that I began to realize, oh, that's possible. Strangely, I found the freedom by reading stories of freedom within the Gospels rather than burning them. I'm going to read and tell a story about the famine. You'll see that this poem is called The Famine with the word potato crossed out. It's called that because we don't call it in Ireland the potato famine, because it wasn't a potato famine. There was a blight indeed, and John Mitchell in 1861 said, the Almighty indeed sent the potato blight, but the English created the famine. It was totally well known that there was a blight that was traveling across Western Europe and that it would get to Ireland. And Ireland was a highly potato dependent society. And when the first crops were blighted, a letter was sent to Westminster asking that all the ports in Ireland be closed, because by that stage, Ireland, was only 40 years after the Act of Union that took Ireland into this thing called the United Kingdom, which wasn't a vote, of course, it was an act of parliament. The letter went to Westminster asking for the ports to be closed because Ireland was providing, I think it was 60% of the corn and 70% of the beef that was feeding the population of Britain. And the letter came back to say, if there are fewer Irish by the end of this blight, then so much the better. So the population of Ireland in 1845, and this was, I think they were a Liberal government, are they the precursors to Labour? So this isn't something that fits into old imaginations about who wrote that kind of a letter. The population of Ireland in 1845 was anywhere from 9 to 9.5 million. Either 1 or 2 million people died because obviously records weren't being kept over the next 3 years because of the blight, and certainly at least 1 million left. By the time 1880 came along, the population of Ireland was 4 million. So from 1845, 9.5 million to 1880, 4 million, extraordinary, overwhelming. And all for a famine that didn't need to happen because there was so much food in Ireland. And my great-great-grandfather was 6 at the time, and he went with his family, his brother and his parents, they were Irish speakers in West Cork. They went to a soup kitchen run by Protestants. And what you could typically get is that if you converted to Protestantism, you could get soup. And so hence in Ireland, there's this phrase still called, did you take the soup? Which means, did you change your stripes? Did you change your allegiances? And so his brother and parents got lost, or he got lost from them. They all died, presumably. And a Protestant family took my great-great-grandfather in and kept him in their home for the next 5 years, where he learned English. And they were putting him through school, and they were urging him to continue with his schooling. Quite extraordinary, really. They would have put him through all of secondary school, which in early 1850s would have been an amazing thing to have gone through secondary school. But he elected instead to walk to Cork City in the hope that he could find news of his brother and his parents. There must have been hundreds of thousands of orphans all around Ireland wondering, where are my parents? Where are they buried even? Because we know to not even have a resting place is a terrible torture. There are mass graves all around Ireland. I grew up near one of the famine dead, because how do you bury 1 million? And 1 million is a very modest imagination about the amount of people who died, because there wasn't a formal census. Frederick Douglass, the extraordinary American writer and politician and political campaigner for emancipation, himself somebody who had been enslaved and who had escaped, paid a visit to Ireland in 1845. And he said this in Dublin in 1845, which was the first year of the famine: "I can truly say I have spent some of the happiest moments in my life landing in this country. I seem to have undergone a transformation. I live a new life. The warm and generous cooperation extended to me by the friends of my despised race contrasted so strongly with my long and bitter experience in the United States that I look with wonder and amazement on the transition." This is the first of 2 poems. The first of these poems tends to be difficult for British identifying people to hear, the second of which will be difficult for Irish people to hear. So the annoyance will be shared. This is a villanelle. And spuds, I think we all know this, don't we? Spuds is a word for referring to potatoes. Just to be clear, just in case anybody is wondering what that word means. My father likes his spuds piled high upon his plate. My mother likes her peace and her diet magazines. My great-great-granddad was the only one who made it. At the heart of every famine is the scheming of a state to bring a people to their knees for the state's convenience. My father likes his spuds piled high upon his plate. On the phone, an Englishwoman says the Irish are fixated with our stories of the past in a way that's quite obscene, but my great-great-granddad was the only one who made it. My auntie moved to England and learned how to translate between the way a people are and the way their history's been. My father likes his spuds piled high upon his plate. There are proteins in our grass from forgotten famine graves. Some families fed on rotten grass, and my mother tells me my granddad's granddad was the only one who made it. His family had all starved, so he missed his confirmation. Decades later, a priest arranged it, didn't make a scene. My father likes his spuds piled high upon his plate, and my great-great-granddad was the only one who made it. So these two epigraphs here that we had at the beginning of this villanelle, and a villanelle, by the way, is a poem that takes the first line and the third line and repeats them through the ends of the different stanzas that come up before repeating them then together at the end here. So just a little literary piece of consideration of form. So you see that there's an epigraph from John Mitchell and from Frederick Douglass. John Mitchell was a Protestant clergyman from Derry, and it's recorded, written down from him that he'd said that in 1861, but he'd said it years beforehand. And he was sent off as a political prisoner to Van Diemen's Land, what we call Tasmania now, even though it has its own name way older than either Tasmania or Van Diemen's Land. And he was there in penal servitude and then escaped and moved to the southern United States and established a newspaper of which he was the co-editor. And one of the things that I mentioned earlier on is that Irish people like to imagine, because Irish people went through troubles, that therefore when we went to other places, we were a friend of the troubled and were politically aligned with anybody else who'd gone through something that was comparative to what Irish people had gone through. Not the case. This is what John Mitchell wrote in his own newspaper while he was defending the institution of enslavement. He wrote, "The institution of Negro slavery is a sound, just, wholesome institution, and therefore that the question of reopening the African slave trade is a question of expediency alone." And so Irish people love to remember this. Check it out, my God, isn't that a great line to remember? The Almighty indeed sent the blight, but the English created the famine. Irish people do not love to remember that the very same person said this. We love to remember this. At the moment, there's all kinds of considerations of even a statue of Frederick Douglass going up somewhere in Ireland, you know, as a memory to the kind of things he said. And his visit to Ireland in 1845 was quite extraordinary. However, 8 years later, after there had been hundreds of thousands of Irish people landing on the shores of America and engaging in local politics, this is what he said about us. The Irish, who at home readily sympathize with the oppressed everywhere, are instantly taught when they step upon our soil to hate and despise the Negro. They are taught to believe that he eats the bread that belongs to them. Sir, the Irish American will find out his mistake one day. He will find that in assuming our avocation, he has also assumed our degradation. Holding the center means reading things that are profoundly challenging to the center that we think we hold. Reading things that make us go, maybe I'm not the oppressed by this. Maybe I've been the oppressor. Maybe I need to read things from a different point of view. That is the invitation of the intellect, to consider our histories and stories from a point of view outside our own, to displace the center, to do what the Russians called ostranение, which is translated into English as defamiliarization. But a guy that I met once, who was a United Nations translator from English, French, and Russian, said that ostranение is much better translated as other countryization, somehow to have an experience of another country within a narrative, to make your narrative foreign, or to view your narrative as if you're foreign to it, and somehow view it with the lens of critique. That too is involved in holding the center. Holding the center and peace is not in any way about making daisy chains and singing pretty songs. Holding the center and peace is about having profoundly difficult arguments and doing so in a way without recourse to violence or threat. This poem is called Phytophthora infestans, which is the Latin name for the potato blight, just so that you know the context of that. The potato blight goes in to the undersides of the leaves of a potato plant and then rots the crop, and then afterwards the leaves turn white. We love to blame the British for our past, a past that's blighted by a story we won't own. God knows it wasn't that our suffering was mild at home, but when we traveled, we shacked up with empire and smited other places while crying about our home, not with a rot of other people's making, but with a rot our own. And not because of how an empire shackled us, but because of something rotten in us. Certainly a rot of other people's making, not our own, starved us from our villages and homes, but because of something rotten in us, and not a blight that was exploited, we went and starved other peoples from their villages and homes. Our suffering was far from mild at home. Far from home, we uncovered something white inside us. We love to blame the Brits for the stories we won't own. This, for me, is a really important part of paying attention to holding the center, is telling stories that are upsetting. Looking at vantage points into history in a way that will move us away from thinking, oh, therefore I know who we are and we were always doing the good. Finding a way to do that, to explore our racist past, to explore our misogynist past, to explore our male supremacist past. Doing that in a way, paying attention to how we might have been complicit in telling a story of the past and imagining a past that was glorious, that never existed. Instead, I think holding the center is about finding a way that the center can be nurtured by the heart in order to be critical, and holding that there. It is not easy, and it also will probably lose us friends. And that, I think, is a threat to pay attention to. So let me finish off with another poem, and then I'll say a few more things as we finish. Then we'll have a break, and then we'll come back. Where is this poem? Here it is. This is one about Jesus in the desert. And I think that the stories of Jesus in the desert are among the most extraordinary ones that you find in the literature about this strange character of Jesus of Nazareth. The texts say that when he went to the desert, he was tempted by the tempter. Some of them say the devil. And this poem is called Wild. And I suppose partly what I'm thinking is that it's far too convenient to think of being tempted by the devil. You know, if I was in the desert, you know, on a silent retreat, and along comes Lucifer, you know, with blue skin and flames for eyes and a pointy tail and goat's hooves, I'd be like, hello, devil, how are you? And I would find it easy to reject it, you know. If temptation comes in a way that is saying, hello, I'm temptation, well, then it's easy enough to reject it. I have no interest in heroin. So if any of you send me a direct message during our time together and say to me, would you like me to supply you with some heroin? I'll say, no, thanks. I'm surprised you're here. But I do know that for me, there's a curiosity and a fear around gambling. There has been some stories of gambling in the family, and I recognize in me a curiosity about gambling, which is why I've never gambled, because I don't think I would find it so easy to stop if I started. And that is what temptation is, because it is part of you. And so I don't think there was a devil here. I think there was a part of Jesus trying to figure out, who am I going to be? And as such, therefore, I think this was a story of him struggling to know how to hold his own center. Wild. Because you too struggled, you went into the wild with nothing to shield you from the light. You learned to shade your eyes from the sun. You sweated in your sleep in the heat of the day. You made up stories to waste time and to keep the fear away. It didn't work. You wrestled with the devil more subtle than the one you'd read about. He didn't lurk in the corner of your cave or scream at you with a night blue mouth. He didn't roast you or launch himself out at you, all bat wings and hooves. He was always with you, but you didn't see that till the end. You'd been worrying about food and flight and fancy and how to be who you were. You'd been worrying about prayer and the way a man should care for his country when his country's a plaything for a despot. You'd been worrying about thirst and endings. You feared death, not fear, but both made you feel like a failure. One brutal, final, the other goes on forever, just like you and the devil I see through you. As a way to say something else, just as we move into a break, I have been particularly exercised in the last 10 years about how to, in poetry, have considerations of masculinities, because I think unselfish conscious masculinities have so often taken power by force over the last, I don't know, lifetime of the world. And therefore, for me, the poems that I've been writing in the last 10 years have been ones about men, not because I think men are central, but because I think that for my artistic and moral curiosity, what I want to do is to put us men under spotlight, revealing our addictions, revealing our weaknesses. And so this is another way within which I think it is very important to consider the secular nature of being present in the world, is to consider things that hold us to the center, but also consider things that bring us into a secular consideration of the practice of power. And that has so long been in the practice of a violent masculinity that I think there is a need for a century-long reckoning just to begin it, or just to continue it, in terms of paying attention to the addictive levels of power that are manifest and granted to masculinities and their performance in public society, whether that's in politics or in religion or in the arts or in sports or in all of that. Along with that comes a certain heterosexual masculinity that's part of the imagination, but it's not as convenient as that for gay and bisexual men. Because I think gay and bisexual men also inherit extraordinary male privilege that we need to pay attention to and to put under the spotlight too. It's not as easy as saying, oh, it's just the heterosexual men. And so for me, holding the center means finding a way, a curiosity, an imagination, a vantage point where I'm nurtured in order to ask uncomfortable questions. I don't have the answers, but I do know that if I'm asking uncomfortable questions that make other people uncomfortable, but not me, well, then that's not art, that's a tract. I should go back to trying to be a missionary in that case. What I need is to find a way to ask questions that are going to hold me to a center by putting me and my performances and my powers under spotlight in order to critique. That, I think, is what's needed in this context of this. So Stephen might have an announcement. Enjoy your coffee or your tea, and we'll be back here with some questions in 20 minutes.
Okay. Cheers. Thank you.